Good evening and welcome to the Canberra AWS User Group for October 2020. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians, the Ngunnawal tribe of the land where we're presenting from, and pay my respects to their elders past and present. So my name is Brian Farnhill, and tonight I'm going to be taking you through our usual introduction of what's going on in the world of AWS, talking about new features that have been released this month, some white paper updates, letting you know where you can go to get training, and then I'll be handing over to JJ, who's currently sitting in the producer seat, to do our main presentation tonight on AWS Foundations, and talking to some of the updates based on things that have been released and some tips from the field. So I want to talk. I want to talk properly to start with. I want to talk to our YouTube channel to let you all know that is still a thing. So last month we announced we have a YouTube channel now with the full back catalogue of sessions we've done since we went remote and into lockdown. So if you're interested in going back and watching any of the sessions again to learn things from them or share them with your colleagues, they're all there on that YouTube channel at that fantastically long, horrendous URL. Again, my ask for you all is if you could like and subscribe, because when I get to 100 subscribers, YouTube will let me have a friendly URL, which would be easier to share. But for the time being, if you go and search for AWS Canberra User Group, you'll find all of our sessions from March this year through to last month's presentation, and within a few days we'll have tonight's on there as well. So keep an eye out there for YouTube updates. Speaking of updates, AWS has had a bunch this month. So far, we're at 183 new features and releases from the start of this month, which for the data geek in us all, because I love data more than most, looks a little bit like this on the chart. So you can see a little bit down from last month, but we're building up to what is that usual peak of AWS reInvent, which I'll talk to in a little bit. In terms of updates that I wanted to call out this month, there's a few that are on the cards. First of all, who doesn't love a price reduction, especially when it involves machine learning? So Amazon SageMaker has had a price reduction, and you'll see up to 18% reduction in our ML P3 and P2 instances. And this applies to those in the Sydney region and a number of our other regions as well. So now is as good a time as any to start looking at how you can run your machine learning workloads on AWS. Next, AWS IoT Sitewise is now available in the Singapore and Sydney regions. So Sitewise, for those who haven't heard of it, is a service that's targeted towards collecting data from IoT sensors in industrial equipment and bringing it together in ways that make it really easy to store, analyze, and determine insights from that data. So if you've got sensors on different devices and you want to do things like predictive maintenance and those kinds of things, Sitewise is absolutely worth looking at as part of your strategy there, and it's now available here in the Sydney region. Next, I've got a couple of updates related to AWS Lambda. The first one is in preview now. We have Amazon CloudWatch Lambda Insights. So what this does is essentially starts to draw together some information from CloudWatch metrics to provide me meaningful insights into the overall performance of my Lambda functions, looking at things like execution time, memory consumption, those kinds of things, so that we can start to really fine-tune performance and look for trends in that data. So that's now in preview, and if you've got serverless workloads running in Lambda, it's definitely one to look at in terms of how you want to performance tune it. Next is the AWS Lambda Extensions, also in preview. So what Lambda Extensions is a way to integrate external sort of monitoring and telemetry platforms into your Lambda environments without needing to do this in your application code. So say, for example, you had a third-party tool that you wanted to integrate into your Lambda functions to help provide you with telemetry there. Previously, you would have had to put the code into your application logic that would invoke that and provide the telemetry to it. This new preview essentially allows you to do this through something similar to Layers, where I provide the plugin around the application code, which lets me keep my telemetry separate from the logic in my application itself. So again, definitely worth looking at if you've got a keen interest in the monitoring and telemetry space around serverless applications. Next, we've announced AWS Budgets Actions. This one's really interesting. So have you ever had a scenario where you put a budget in and you say, I would like to be notified when we're forecasting to go over that budget this month, so that when you get notified, you can go and take action based on that? Budget actions allows you to automate a number of different types of actions in response to these budget findings. For example, I could do something along the lines of when it looks like my developer account is going to go over a threshold for that month, automatically stop that developer from being able to turn on EC2 instances, thus helping minimize the rest of the bill for that month. So we can start to do things based on those budgets and have a really event-driven architecture around how we're managing our budgets. Next is the porting assistant for .NET has now been open sourced. So a few months ago, we made an announcement around the tool that was the AWS Porting Assistant for .NET applications. What this is designed to do is analyze your full .NET applications and help you visualize and understand how you could migrate that to .NET Core and be able to run it on Linux instances. Now, this helps you do things like scanning for dependencies and identifying where dependencies can migrate to .NET Core and where they can't, so that you can start to really quantify the effort involved in that migration. So this month, we've made that tool open source. And the good news there is that if you've got additional things about that tool that you want to integrate with and customize to suit your particular needs to better assess that effort, you can now do so because you've got access to the full source code. All right, next one is Amazon CloudFront has announced a new feature called Origin Shield. So what Origin Shield is designed to do is help really minimize the amount of traffic that goes from CloudFront back to your origin. So say, for example, I have some web servers as my origin. I'm sitting them behind CloudFront because I want to provide a really good scaling story. What Shield is going to do for me here, Origin Shield is going to do for me, is it's going to start doing things like when a request is received from one of our regional points in the CloudFront network, it will send that cache response to some of those other regional places, meaning that you no longer see requests coming in every time a regional cache needs to make a request. The cache will populate it around the globe for you, which helps minimize the number of requests that go to your origin. The other good news story here as well is that if you're using Lambda at edge around those origin request and response events, you will see fewer of those execute, which can then reduce your Lambda bill attached to using Lambda at edge. So this is a really great way to help CloudFront scale your applications even further. Next, AWS Step Functions now has support for Amazon Athena. This is two of my favorite serverless services, so I was always going to make sure this one made the cut this month. Step Functions, for those who haven't heard of it, is essentially our managed workflow service, a state manager service, where you can define a business process flow and different steps that will take place in sequence and parallel and with conditional logic. And you can already integrate that with a number of different AWS services. Now you can integrate it with Athena, which is essentially our serverless querying service to query unstructured data stored in S3. So now I can use Athena to query for data from S3 and then based on the results of that data, go and perform additional steps in my step functions. So this gives me a really great way to bring unstructured data into an automated process flow in a completely serverless, low-cost way. Next is for our Fargate customers, the AWS Load Balancer Controller. So what this does is it makes it really easy to incorporate a network load balancer into your Kubernetes clusters, but to do so in a way where you're not forced to target individual IP addresses. Instead, we can start mapping the network load balancers through to your individual pods in EKS running in Fargate. So what this means is it becomes a lot easier for me to be very particular about the load balancer configuration and run multiple pods behind a single load balancer there, so I've got some scale around that without putting lots of individual load balancers in because I had to do that for targeting. So again, one worth checking out if you're a Fargate user. And lastly, AWS Shield now provides global and per-account event summaries to all AWS customers. So in the event of an attempted denial of service attack, for example, if you were a Shield Advanced customer, you would receive a summary of that event with details around things like how much traffic was detected and where was it coming from and that sort of thing. So previously, that was available only for our Shield Advanced customers. Now, it is available for every AWS Shield customer. And the good news is that Shield Standard is automatically enabled on almost every public AWS endpoint. It's there for CloudFront, it's there for our load balancers, it's there for Elastic IP addresses. So it provides you with layer 3 and 4 protection automatically as just part of being in that AWS network. And now you can use it to get details about those kinds of events that are happening in your account. So it's super useful information to have. So as always, I like to talk about training courses and things that are happening, and we are, of course, still in a very remote world. So training is still a very remote thing you can do. If you head to aws.training, you'll be able to go through and find yourself all sorts of training courses happening in a myriad of different time zones that you can do remotely. So it's still a really great time to go and get yourself upskilled in different areas of AWS. Also, the online Tech Talks is another great resource that is worth checking out in terms of a training and readiness resource. Other updates this month in terms of white papers. So there was a bunch more than I've got on this slide, but these were the ones that I thought were worth calling out. First of all, there was an update around, a new one around how Accenture has industrialized machine learning workloads on AWS. So again, if you're getting into machine learning, worth checking out what one of our partners has been doing in that space. There's one around benchmarking AWS and HPC services. So again, if you were into our presentation last month that Racer gave around high performance compute, there's a new white paper that talks through some of that and how to benchmark those workloads on AWS. There's one there around livestock counting at the edge. So using AWS Greengrass to be able to go and run machine learning on edge devices, such as a deep lens, that can help you do things like counting the number of livestock at different places. Again, really interesting use case. One that is near and dear to my own heart that got updated this month, the Introduction to DevOps on AWS white paper. If you're interested in anything related to DevOps on AWS, this is a must-read white paper. And lastly, understanding your application readiness when migrating to AWS. So this is another new white paper this month that starts talking to you about things you might want to consider that are specific to your applications when you want to migrate them into AWS. All right, so before I hand over to JJ, I also wanted to talk about reInvent. So I mentioned at the start that we're heading into that time of year where reInvent takes place, and as with everything else being virtual, this year we are not going to be in Las Vegas. And this year, reInvent is going to be a free online conference that goes for 3 weeks. Yes, you heard me right. We are starting from the 30th of November through to December 18th. There will be 3 weeks worth of content that we are rolling out across that 3-week period that you can freely access online. So those of you who were not able to get to Las Vegas for previous reInvents, now you can get to all the same content straight away as it happens at the same time as everybody else. So registration opens late October, according to our website, which we are running out of days for late October, so it will be very soon. If you're interested, go to reinvent.awsevents.com and you can register your interest to be notified when it opens. Some of the things that we have got up on the website that we'll talk about for sessions that will be happening during reInvent. Of course, there is always the Andy Jassy keynote, our CEO. There's the AWS partner keynote, so Sandy Carter and the likes talking in there. There's the machine learning keynote, the infrastructure keynote, Werner Vogels and his keynote as CTO. So lots of really key sessions being run by the leaders of AWS, talking about where we're going and the broad strategies for how we're operating, so that you can hear about that and take that information with you in terms of things you want to do with AWS. So absolutely worth checking out. And did I mention it's free? Definitely worth looking at. So on that note, I'm going to hand over to JJ now as we do a quick switch from producer desk over to the front here, and he's going to take us through his AWS Cloud Foundations session. Over to you, JJ.
Thanks, Brian, and obviously a silky smooth transition between speakers online, I'm sure, for the experience for everyone there. So those that don't know me, my name's JJ. I'm a cloud architect here in Canberra with Brian. I work in the professional services team, helping deliver and accelerate cloud migrations and cloud journeys for our customers. So tonight I'll be talking a bit about AWS Cloud Foundations and giving you some of the tips and tricks and recommendations from our professional services experience working with customers throughout the public sector in Australia and New Zealand. We'll be going through a bit of an explanation about what it is, and for those of you that have been around AWS for a while, you'll be familiar with the terms like landing zone. This isn't a talk about what is a landing zone. It's we'll have a bit of level setting about why we need it and some of the material there that will be familiar to you, but certainly we're going to focus more on the second part around some of the tips and recommendations about how to approach your foundational cloud journey. And finally, we'll have a few resources as well. So to start with, what are cloud foundations? So as I said, I'm not going to give a what is a landing zone kind of talk. A landing zone is a very key part of a cloud foundation journey. But when we're talking to our customers, when we're working with them in professional services, a landing zone is one part of getting started more broadly in AWS and getting moving forward. And we found it helpful to call that a cloud foundations with them. But ultimately, the initial requirement is balancing a couple of needs very, very strongly. So within our public sector customers, there's always a need to have governance and security front of mind, and that central IT function and the ability to manage the compliance and security state of the environment. But at the same time, balancing that with the needs of the application teams and the builders in the organisation, and enable them to them to move at speed and be able to still perform in an agile way in the company, or in the organisation. So typically, historically, those two outcomes around moving fast or about being agile in the way you deliver and keeping a very strong governance and secure footprint have kind of been at odds, not by intention, but within the cloud, you should absolutely need and want both of those. First, let's start on a bit of the why we need to think about this when we're starting on our foundation as an organisation. So part of them says, well, I can just get an AWS account. Why can't I just use that easily and just get moving? And there's a few reasons why we think about AWS for our customers in a broader, more scaled out sense. The first of those is there's many teams in these environments. And so if you're delivering many services on AWS and you've got many teams playing in one account, then they can stand on each other's toes. And they can also get in the way in terms of almost like a noisy neighbour situation where one misbehaving app might get throttled on an API and start impacting other applications. And that takes me to the second part of the why, which is one of isolation. So by keeping those sort of workloads isolated from each other, you protect them from that issue. But at a bare minimum, I like to talk to my customers about at least keeping their production workloads isolated from their non-production workloads so that they get that level of isolation and protection of the critical workloads. Now, separately, the different accounts and the non-production and production example is a great one where your security and compliance requirements might be different between the two parts. So your production environments are typically held to a much higher standard than perhaps your development or innovation environments in that space. And if you've been affected by something like a machinery of government change or an acquisition of another organisation, then you might have some fundamentally different business processes running in the environment. So keeping those different parts of the business or those different business areas separated might make logical sense to your organisation. And finally, when it comes to billing in AWS, the only true way to get a sense of what a workload's costing to you is keep it within an account. There's costs such as data egress is the classic example, where that data egress charge is charged at the account level, and you can't tag it, you can't sort of apportion it back to each of your areas within the business unless you sort of wrap it up at the account level. And so when we think about that and what customers need out of this, we think, okay, we need sort of three things. We want to make sure that we've got that security and the resource boundary sense, so we've got that level of isolation that we talked about, that noisy neighbour problem around account limits or API throttling if you get one application that's doing a bit more, and that billing separation. We kind of land on the idea that in AWS for us, a resource container is an AWS account. That is our resource boundary and the way we think about it. Now, if you step forward through this with some of our content online and our best practice guidance around a multi-account framework, you end up here. And I'm not going to talk through this, but if you need to understand the why of the way we build this multi-account framework, there's a great video and some blog posts that I'll link to later on. But for the purposes of this talk, you just need to understand that there is a multi-account framework, and we're going to sort of think within these sort of areas for some of the tips and recommendations moving forward from here. But I absolutely, if this is something you're going to do, recommend you go and explore that other content. Now, from here, when we have our foundational environment and that multi-account setup, what are some of the goals that we want to achieve as a foundational cloud team that's implementing this? Now, some of them are reasonably straightforward. We want to be highly automated. And the reason for that is very simple. We don't want our foundational cloud team to become a bottleneck. And if you're not highly automated, then that's a very real risk for the team. But at the same time as doing that automation, it also helps you scale as your organisation grows, and as you adopt the cloud further, you want to make sure that your foundational capability has the capacity to grow with you to do what you need to do. And related to the automation part, but you want it to be self-service. Again, it's part of that bottleneck discussion, but you also want to make sure that it's easy for your innovators to go and do stuff by themselves. You don't want to put process bottlenecks in the way of them to slow them down. So you want to make sure that they can get out and deliver your services quickly and efficiently. Which is related to the next part around security and compliance. And the way we term this is guardrails, not blockers, which is a way to say bake in all of the security and compliance into what you're doing. And my mental model for it is to make sure that the right thing to do is the easy thing to do. And that way your developers and your builders will just naturally go down that path. And any environment like this has to be auditable. We have to know who did what, where and when as a part of our good governance and good security. And lastly, when you start on your cloud journey or when you're progressing through it, you don't know everything there is to know about the way your team will work in cloud and the way your organisation will work in cloud. So whatever you build has to be flexible. And now, at this point, when you're listening to a normal AWS Landing Zone talk, this is where we tell you you need a landing zone. And it's still true. Like, this is not... This is still a best practice way to get started in AWS, and it gives you the place where you can build some new capabilities, you can migrate your workloads in. But I need to talk a little bit and take a little bit of a pivot for some of our customers who've been in AWS for a while for some of the recommendations that are coming up to make a bit more sense. So here's a little bit of a history lesson. So I've been at AWS for almost 5 years, and when I started, we used to talk about landing zones as some custom code that we'd work with a customer, and everyone was bespoke and unique as we went out and rolled it out. And that was what we first started calling a landing zone. Now, AWS sometimes aren't the best at naming things when it comes to helping users understanding. So when we spoke to customers about this landing zone experience, they said, can you help make it just a bit easier? Like, make it a bit more automated, a bit faster for us to deploy and get started. And that was where the AWS automated landing zone solution came from. And so this was, it succeeded in what it was trying to do. It got customers starting much faster than they were before, but it was a big thing to manage, and customers had to build some specialised skills to run it. And so what they invariably asked was, well, can you just do that for us? Turn it into a service to let it consume it. And that's where Control Tower comes in. So depending on when you got started in AWS, how often you've gone back to look at what you built and where you are today, you might have a mental model that slots in at any of those points. So with that, let's move on to some of the foundational tips and recommendations from our experience. And the way I'm going to talk through this is I'll start at the top with some of the service control policies and the organisational units and some of the organisations construct, and then slowly work down from there into the actual accounts themselves and the different capabilities within that. So starting at the top level from our service control policies, we probably need to update the wording here, but there's a concept around whitelisting and blacklisting services to basically think of them as allowed in a blocked list. Absolutely the way that they should be used. And the key here is that they're invisible to all users in the member accounts, including root. And I'll come back to that a couple of times as we move on. In terms of recommendations when thinking about service control policies, be aware of the limits when you're thinking of this. Now, in terms of limits, you can have 5 policies applied to an account or an OU, and there's actually a size limit as well in aggregate when you actually processing those as well. Now, if you're a Control Tower customer and using Control Tower, it will take 2 or 3 of those slots. So all of a sudden you may only have 2 spare spots that you can actually apply service control policies from for your organisation. So if you go into your design or your activities to build out your control policies, understanding that can really help. Now we cover the next one in our organisation's best practices, which I'll link to later, but use service control policies to functionally disable the root user in those member accounts. Now if you remember, service control policies also apply to root, so you can actually think about the way that you can lock down that root and have a true defence in depth approach to the root user. And lastly, disable service APIs that you won't be using. We use this commonly in customers that I work with to provide a list of services that are whitelisted. So in a federal government context, that list can frequently start from the services that have been accredited to our IRAP protected level. And so that's a very easy point for them to start with and get moving from there, and everything else gets explicitly denied. So moving from the service control policies into the OU structure of organisations, an OU is just a grouping of AWS accounts. And so those groupings of accounts is where you apply your service control policies. And a best practice is to apply your service control policies at the organisational unit level. But what that organisational unit structure should represent is a grouping of permissions and where the control policies need to be applied as a logical group rather than a business structure. So it can be tempting to build it out and say, I've got one for Department A, one for Department B, one for Department C. But if you think about it in terms of the way the policy is applied, again, the federal government context, you might think about different security classifications. So you might have workloads running at an unclassified level in one area and workloads running in a protected level in another OU. And that allows you to really manage it based on security policy. So when you're thinking about that design, think about how likely that group of accounts is to need a policy. A certain common set of policies. And down the bottom there's a link to a blog post that talks through a bunch of the recommendations. This slide deck will be available after the event, so don't feel like you've got to screen capture all of this as we go. Now, back to our multi-account framework that we're thinking of here. So we've talked a bit about the high-level service control policies, the organisational unit structure. So now let's dive into the way we actually manage the accounts inside those OUs. And from that point of view, first and foremost, make it really easy to automate and create accounts. Now, for new customers, absolutely, Control Tower is a great way to go. That has an account factory within it that lets you spin up accounts quickly and efficiently in a compliant way. But if you're an existing customer who's perhaps built a bunch of automation in AWS today, still go back and consider Control Tower and think about some of the new capabilities it's got and whether or not you can use it to retire some technical debt. But if you do that evaluation and you decide that the automation systems you've built and are working for you today are doing their job, then don't use it today. That's perfectly fine. But certainly have a look because it's done a number of things. Now, in terms of that account management, a couple of extra dot points there. So you heard it mentioned in the new releases this month, which is very exciting, but AWS budgets, I recommend that you get in the practice of applying them really early when you've got customers coming into your foundational environment. Get them used to that feedback loop of costs being incurred in the environment and how much it's costing them to run their environment. And as you mature, then absolutely start taking advantage of some of the actions that you heard Brian talk about in the earlier session. And additionally, alternate contacts is something that is unfortunately one of the areas in the AWS environment that you can't hit with an API to set them. And so what you've got to do is think about having a secondary process or some other way to go in and set those, especially on important accounts like accounts running workloads, especially production workloads. You can try and do some fairly difficult stuff with browser automation and try and do that. One of my colleagues has tried to do that with limited success. I certainly wouldn't recommend it as a standard approach. And lastly, no talk about governance and AWS is complete without mentioning tags at least once. Think about them up front when you're deploying your accounts, because as soon as you start doing this stuff, you're going to want to, at the very minimum, start attributing costs to places. So some tips in this space. If you have looked at organisations previously and sort of been just working with it for a while, go back and have a look at the way some of our new service integrations have happened. There's a lot more services integrate with organisations, and you might be able to reduce some of the steps in your account deployment or perhaps remove some of the custom code you've written in your account deployment steps. A key one there is the CloudFormation StackSets integration with AWS organisations. That's a really powerful way to roll out a bunch of security baseline stuff via putting stack sets directly to an OU, and it will automatically manage the deployed stack sets in any account in that OU. It's just a very, very powerful way to save yourself some time. If you're a Control Tower customer, I just want to make sure you're aware that there is now a thing that came out a few months ago called lifecycle event notifications. And if you initially perhaps looked at Control Tower and said, the guardrails are a bit limited, I'm not sure it's right for us, despite the product moving on as well, you can now use these lifecycle events and it will emit an event when it's completed with its account provisioning, and you can use that event as a trigger to commence more automation operations and fill in the gap that you may have had before. And that's very much part of the customizations for Control Tower solution that you see below. We deploy that with a lot of our customers to be able to extend that security baseline that's provided in the native services. And lastly, just another tip, there's no API for Control Tower. So if you're rolling out a bunch of their guardrails, there's a bunch of sort of click, wait. And that's fine, it's just you've got to go in prepared for that. So now we've thought about the way we're going to provision our accounts, and wanted to start thinking about what happens actually inside the accounts. So what's actually going on inside the accounts that we need to consider when we're doing our foundational deployment. And as you can see, it's everything from identity management, so getting users and getting our automated systems into the environment, some networking, you need to potentially connect it in a hybrid way or even just within AWS, getting security and logging and all the basic operational stuff, as well as implementing some of the actual AWS services to build workloads in the end. So let's dive into some of these. So from an identity management point of view, consider your account strategy in terms of whether or not you've got a lot of teams within one account or fewer accounts, or you've actually got a good practice where you've got a lot of people in their own isolated accounts, because what that lets you do is simplify your IAM policies a bit, and it makes them easier to administer and easier for your people that are new to cloud to understand and to debug. I've said federate if possible. The reason federation is great is from a delivery point of view of your project is you inherit a whole bunch of process that should exist in whatever you're federating with in terms of onboarding new users, disabling and deleting old users. If you don't get that as a capability from your upstream federation, you've got to build it yourself in the AWS platform, and so that can affect the amount of work your cloud foundation team's got to do. And lastly, in terms of root in the member accounts, there's a conversation here to have around if you've got the service control policies in place to functionally disable the root user and you're deploying a large number of accounts, say for example you're giving one to each developer to enable them to give them a sandpit or a development playground, whether or not you go through the process of recovering the password, setting MFA for a lower risk account, there's a conversation you can have based on relative risk there, but certainly for any account running a corporate workload, I'd absolutely go through the process of recovering the password, still set MFA, and then put your defense in depth security policy on top of it as well. Some additional tips in this space, for those that didn't notice, AWS SSO got an API recently, and so that's meant a whole bunch of stuff is now automatable using AWS SSO, and that can really help with your multi-account deployments and the automation thereof. Access Analyzer for IAM is a tool that's a really great way of integrating with AWS organizations to give you a view of where perhaps you've got resources that are being shared or are being accessed by somewhere where you didn't mean that to happen or may not be desired by the organisation. So certainly turn it on and get that visibility. In terms of root MFA, a quick couple of points about using the different versions of hardware MFA. So for those that aren't aware, you've got a couple of options. One of them is the old school Gemalto tokens. You press a button, they've got a little battery in them, they give you a 6-digit code. The other one is the U2F keys. YubiKey is a great example that I personally use. The U2F keys have a couple of really, really good advantages here. You can use one YubiKey or one U2F key for many AWS accounts. Whereas with Gemaltos, it's a one-to-one mapping. So you end up in this space where you've got to order a ton of Gemalto tokens in a multi-account environment. That's compounded by the fact you can still only buy one from our store at a time, last time I checked in Australia. So I really recommend U2F keys. The one place where the Gemalto keys really have an advantage is in those very highly secure environments where USB devices are just prohibited. Now, federation-wise, also consider your upstream security. And by that, I mean when you federate with a directory, make sure that that directory has appropriate security controls in place so that you don't inadvertently have someone providing a high level of access into your AWS environment. So you might have a junior person adding someone to a group that is inadvertently giving away the keys to the AWS kingdom. And also make sure it supports the same levels that you want in terms of does it provide MFA as well. So after the identity, the next thing to think about is networking. And when we think about networking and when you look at our slideware on it and the talk that you'll watch later, you'll see the slide that looks like this for our multi-account approach to networking. My one observation from the field in this approach is many of my customers have a dedicated networking team. Sometimes it might even be outsourced. And it's very nice for them to be able to contain the entire networking capability in a single account. And so what they end up doing is put their direct connect as well as their transit gateway and some of those capabilities in their networking account and then do this. They move all the network capability from that shared services environment where the cloud team might run it and into a dedicated networking environment where the networking team can run it. So depending on how the organisation you're working with operates, either of those models are perfectly fine. Now, networking is a massive topic. I could talk about it for hours and hours and hours. So I'm not going to go too deep in here, but I wanted to give you a few high-level points to think about as you're going through this. So VPC and subnet design when you start on your foundations, if you're a Control Tower customer, the networking part of Control Tower isn't ideal in most situations because it gives the same side range to every VPC that gets provisioned. So almost all of my customers will have a need to design and think about the way they're going to build and deploy VPCs. Network segmentation, and so the next 2 dot points around segmentation, firewalls, transit gateway and private link, I won't do that stuff credit here, but you need to think about the way you're architecting for that level of security and challenge the way you traditionally thought about that. And I highly recommend a talk that I've included a link at the end here on many VPC architectures that was given at last reInvent. It's got some really, really good architectural patterns and models to think about with this, and it also ties into the internet access patterns at the last dot point there. I'd also add, so from a hybrid connectivity point of view, a lot of our customers have a requirement that everything that goes over Direct Connect, even though it's a private dedicated link, has to be encrypted. And by default, it's not. So up front, think about the architecture that's going to give you potentially even the dual layer encryption where you have encryption over Direct Connect, either using our native VPN tooling in a public VIF or some EC2 routers that encrypt traffic. But also potentially how you get that VPN stood up as well. Now, from a transit gateway attachment point of view, when you are provisioning new accounts and getting them connected to your hybrid network, that doesn't happen automatically. You've got to build some automation in there to be able to adapt it. And to the principles of being highly automated and self-service, you want to think about the automation capabilities and how you're going to provide that. We do have a solution called the Serverless Transit Network Orchestrator that may or may not help you out here. Certainly search for that one. And from a DNS point of view, the Route 53 resolver, you have to use our DNS to make a whole bunch of our services work. But what Route 53 resolver lets you do is centrally manage and control all of the forwarding policies to make sure that you're getting all of the right DNS traffic forwarded potentially back into your hybrid on-premises network and leaving the AWS stuff in AWS. Now some tips here. So I've already mentioned the Control Tower limitations and the way the stack works there from a networking point of view. A point for people who are mindful of timelines, so getting Direct Connect established and for some customers even getting a VPN established can take a while with their network providers. So in terms of your project delivery, think about that really early on. You don't need to have all of the information about your Direct Connect design to at least start the discussions around procurement and things like that. And lastly, for many of my customers, having DNS logging out of our Route 53 resolver was a problem for a long time, but it has been, we now have query logs happening on the VPC DNS. And so if that was an issue for you previously when you evaluated working in AWS, have a look at it again. It's now a gap that's been filled. And speaking of security functions like that, the tooling is the next part of the accounts I'd like to have a look at. So the organisation's integration for a whole bunch of services has improved over the years. So if you've got a bunch of automation that you've built, especially around enabling CloudTrail and GuardDuty and config, there's now a much better story around integrating with organisations. So perhaps you can retire some tech debt, get rid of some of the custom code and just let us manage that stuff for you. The organisation's integration is really, really good. A comment, the config is essential for compliance at scale. It's the only way you'll be able to get that continuous view of compliance throughout your AWS organisation, and it's also required for a security hub to help power all the checks that it does. And from a security hub point of view, there's a lot of standards and there's a lot of rules that you can enable in there. When you turn on some of those standards, it uniformly applies the checks over all of the accounts. So what that can actually start doing is start generating a whole bunch of findings or a whole bunch of feedback in the console. So you want to actively manage that to avoid alert fatigue in some of your operators. And potentially for some checks, you may even want to disable the checks in Security Hub and then selectively apply them using a custom guardrail elsewhere in the organisation. Again, if you're looking at some of this stuff, consider the customizations for the Control Tower. It allows you to automatically extend your deployment environment, and so you can add in additional security parts. Some tips here, just some pointers on Control Tower. So the Control Tower CloudTrail bucket, it has a fixed retention of 1 year. So that is not enough for a number of my customers from an audit point of view and a compliance point of view, but it's very, very easy to engineer around just by replicating the content to another bucket. So if that's your case, it's just a small gotcha to be aware of. And the bucket is encrypted with an AWS managed KMS key, but it's not encrypted with an AWS customer master key, which is an important consideration for some customers to be aware of. And a couple of points on the detective guardrails. So the detective guardrails, the way they're named, some of them might be disable a public RDS instance. I probably haven't got that name quite right, but it doesn't actually do the thing it says it's going to do. It just tells you that in this case, if an RDS instance is public and you've got to go and do something about it. And so for people that are new to the platform or people that are new to the service, understanding that difference is an important first step. And also the detective guardrails, they're only deployed in regions that Control Tower supports. Now, for the vast majority of my customers that run primarily in AP Southeast 2, which is our Sydney region, that's not a problem at all. But if you're running multi-region, it may be something you need to consider. Now, in terms of logging and the data that comes out of your foundational environments, getting from your foundational deployment where you generate a whole bunch of logs out of CloudTrail, S3, VPC flow logs, CloudFront potentially, some load balancers once you get workloads in there. There's a whole bunch of traffic that's generated. Making sure that as you go through this, you've got tools to be able to gather and analyze those logs is really important. And one of those might be something you have today. If you've got a SIEM or a log analytics solution that you can point at AWS and start ingesting, it might be a great way to get you started with and minimize the disruption to your organization. But equally, if you don't, you can use one of Brian's favourite services, Athena, or our Elasticsearch service to really get you started quickly in that space as well. And only one tip on the logging front. In your multi-account environment, keep the humans out of the log archive account. That should be for nothing but logs. All of the things that the humans use, all the systems that analyse them, they should all be running from a separate account. In terms of additional guardrails, you're almost certainly going to need these at some stage in your cloud journey. The built-in guardrails will get you a long way down the path, but you'll almost certainly want to tailor it to your organisation in some way. And examples might be if you are running multi-region, doing that, supporting regions that are outside of Control Tower's remit, or just doing something that isn't included in the native toolset. And if you're rolling your own environment, if you've built your own custom automation, obviously you're doing this stuff already. Again, customizations for Control Tower can help you here if you need to do some additional stuff, specifically custom checks. Again, the CloudFormation StackSets integration with AWS organizations is a really powerful way to roll out custom guardrails and apply them at the OU level. So where I talked about being a bit more selective, that's a really neat way to do it, because if you remember, they should be aligned by the type of policy they need. And if you're doing Security Hub in regions outside of Control Tower, you're going to need another config aggregator to get that data. And one little tip here, as a part of your journey, make sure you've got a habit of going through and just checking in on the Control Tower dashboards, the config dashboard, Security Hub. There's likely going to be, as you go through, some opportunities to further automate your environment and provide better feedback to your different teams, be it your cloud team, your security operations team, or your application teams. Now, operations integration. So this part of a cloud journey, in my opinion, is frequently underestimated, but vital, absolutely vital to the success of a cloud journey. So in this sense, I mean, it's very rare that I would come to an AWS environment or an AWS project where I don't have to interact with an existing IT organisation in some way, shape or form. I've always got to get jobs logged, or I've got to have some documentation put somewhere. There's a whole bunch of stuff that goes on in any IT environment. And so the integration with the existing part, even if you're building a brand new AWS environment, will happen at some stage. And if you don't factor it in, you can get a long way down the path from your Cloud Foundations project and hit a lot of roadblocks as you try and get workloads moving. So the earlier you can think about this stuff in your life cycle and in your deployment, the happier you'll be. And depending on your operating model, so, and by this I mean if you've got a more traditional central IT that's providing a bunch of services out to customers like backup, monitoring, server builds, and they're just running the application code over the top, then there's a bunch of services that you're going to need to think about how you integrate with your existing stuff around monitoring and backup as two great examples. So think about how that looks as you go down this path to support those. If you've got an organisation, however, that's a bit more distributed teams, a bit more DevOps aligned, shall we say, then that might look slightly different for you. And certainly the amount of input your cloud team will have in those environments will be less. And again, to emphasise it, the operations integration part is really key in terms of successfully migrating workloads. Building your landing zone and starting that migration is only one part of your cloud journey. A real measure of success will be what happens when something goes wrong on the other side. How quickly can you respond to incidents? How quickly can you make change, and how quickly can you do that in an organisation is really, really key. Now, some tips here. So service catalog where appropriate, think about publishing it. So in terms of stuff like your VPCs and our partner offerings like ServiceNow, there's a lot of strong integration you can do in that ecosystem to start providing these services out of a service catalog, and I'll talk a bit more about that on the next slide as well. This is a bit of a vocally self-critical part on Amazon. Some of our alerts that come out of our services aren't the most human readable. And so if you've got more of a social life than I do, you probably don't like getting blobs of JSON in your email, but for some people like me, they're quite fun, I'm sure. But think about that as your part of your customer experience. Make sure the alerts are meaningful, and you might have to catch those alerts and turn them into something a bit more human readable. So from there into the actual resources that you put into the accounts themselves. And so thinking about that as a cloud foundational team, this is around how do you provide the parts for your builders to go and build in the environment. And some of that is just around the automation capabilities that you provide in there. And a great example that I like to talk customers through here is how you provide a standard operating environment, a SOE, or in our case we call it an Amazon machine image, out to your workload accounts. And so one mental model that I like is have a central cloud team that provides a standard operating environment, and that might be done via an automated pipeline that rolls in all the patches for a given month or whatever it is. And when it's fully baked, that image, it then sends a notification into an event stream, and all of your workloads that are listening to that event stream can pick it up, and they can run a secondary pipeline that customizes that base SOE for their application. And once you get a bit more mature at that, if you think about what that looks like end to end, all of a sudden you can fully automate your monthly patching. You can just have it automatically be deployed into your central pipeline and then have it consumed and rolled out automatically through auto-scaling groups or other deployment mechanisms in other accounts. Now, in terms of other AWS stuff required in the account, there's a bit of a conversation to have around approving and deploying patterns. So think about it as a LAMP stack or a full Microsoft stack, so IIS and SQL, versus actually just publishing building blocks. So by building blocks, I mean things like publishing an approved RDS instance that has the right encryption settings, the right backup settings, and all of the other stuff that you need for your environment, so that you can actually just let builders get on with building. Because in my experience, if you try and publish those patterns and that full stack, it almost always needs to be customized in some way. And that will place much more of a burden on your central cloud team if you've got to start making things bespoke. Whereas if you just publish the building blocks and allow the builders to go and build, and the building blocks are already in approved configuration, then they can go and do that, and you can put more automated checks into both their pipelines as well as your continuous compliance view. And at any point in time, you can detect whenever the configuration is drifted from what you see as an organisational standard. And now there's a part there about publishing known good architectures and understanding that, which is less about the code and more about the other communications parts of being a cloud team. Now, in terms of the cloud team itself, it's a very, very important part of getting started here, and our foundational team, when we get started, will have a few key parts to make them successful. The first of those is executive sponsorship. You absolutely want an executive that can help you with the senior stakeholder engagement and help you get things moving forward in the cloud, and help you with some air cover as you're going through as well. And make sure you haven't just got a bunch of techies going to build some cool techie stuff. Now, in AWS, we have this sense of a cloud enablement engine, which is the foundational team, but it's made up of two key areas: the cloud platform engineering team and the cloud business office. And if you're not doing both of those capabilities up front, you're going to miss out on a few key areas. Some examples of that are around your financial operations. How are you going to manage the finances within the org? Because that's a new capability when you go to cloud. How do you do the training and the organisational change management, as well as some of more of those sort of development and team activities. And lastly, on customer experience, again, self-service is really important. But when you're talking about your cloud team, what you want is you want people in that team that are positive for change. And by that I mean you want people who will go into this and they'll understand that it's not perfect. But when they find a rough edge or when they find something that's not wrong, they'll smooth it out for you. They'll accept that that's part of the journey and they'll keep the team moving forward, as opposed to someone who goes through that process, finds something that's broken and goes, oh, I'm kind of done. This thing just doesn't work. I don't get this cloud thing. So you want change positive people in your team as a part of that. And some implementation tips for your project. Focus on business outcomes. Now, as much as I love building cloud stuff, a foundational AWS Landing Zone capability is not actually a business outcome in and of itself. The workloads that run on top of it are where the business value lies and where the business outcomes are. So make sure you've got some business outcomes that you can tie to, because that will give your team focus about what it needs to deliver as a part of this project, and really helps focus the engineering efforts and when you need to go and build. And again, I'd emphasise the importance of a few points. So self-service is key, both from a customer experience point of view and a scaling point of view for your team. If you're going to, implementing hybrid connectivity takes time. Think about ordering your direct connect early and your VPN early. Operations integration is absolutely key. Really make sure you've got one eye on that and you've got people helping you get through that process. And lastly, we have a tool to help you self-service comparing yourself to a AWS best practice. And that tool is the AWS Well Architected tool. And we absolutely recommend that as you go through this journey, you use that tool to reflect on the work you've done and to actually assess yourself against AWS best practice. And if you'd like a fresh set of eyes, I absolutely recommend that you go and engage our solution architecture team, and they can help you facilitate one of those sessions with your team and help bring some, as I said, a fresh pair of eyes to that review. And if again you'd like someone to help you facilitate that review and then help you drive through some remediation or some improvement activities, that's where my team professional services can absolutely help. So with all that, here's a bunch of resources that I've called out during the talk. There's some really, really good stuff there. There's a bunch of reInvent talks that have that. There's some blog posts. The bottom two white papers on how to get started from a people point of view. They're really small, they're really easy to digest, and they're very, very practical about how to get started on this stuff. So if you've got potentially managers or someone that you need to help understand how that organisation stuff works, I highly recommend they have a look at those too. And with some final thoughts, Brian mentioned reInvent before. In a few weeks, a bunch of the stuff and a bunch of those resources I just gave you will all be refreshed. And so there'll be new things that come out, there'll be new advice that we have. A bunch of this foundational stuff is going to only be built on. None of the stuff that I've talked you through today will hopefully be wrong. And Other than that, if you need some more help or you want someone to help assess where you're at and how you can improve what you're doing today, come and talk to us. Come and talk to your account teams, talk to us as professional services. We can absolutely help you go from there. And with that, thank you everyone. We'll be online and I'll be online for a while in the chat window. So if there's any questions about what you saw here or if you'd like to bounce anything off me, I'll be there for a while. And with that, I will hand back to Brian.
Excellent. Thank you very much, JJ. So wrapping up things to just run through with you here. I usually ask this at the front of the session, but we've moved it to the back to stick fresh in your heads. What do you want to hear? We love getting feedback from you about what are the topics that are interesting that you would like us to dive deeper into. Also, if you've got something that you want to present, this is a community group. We love getting presenters who don't work for AWS, who want to come through and just talk about their experiences, the good, the bad, and the ugly. In particular, what we're putting together for next month is going to be a bunch of smaller talks. So if you only want to talk for like 5 or 10 minutes about something you did, I very much so want to hear from you to potentially put you onto our list for next month. So please reach out through Meetup or stalk me on LinkedIn or Twitter or any of the places where I am fairly easily accessible. Submit your feedback, please. JJ really wants to know what everybody thought of that talk. So Meetup, if you've registered through there, we'll give you a notification saying, hey, tell us what you thought. We do look at it month to month, and we use it to help inform decisions around what content we bring and what works and what doesn't. So again, if you've got any opinions around that, please go through Meetup and submit your feedback. It will only take you a minute or so to do. And lastly, friends don't let friends miss the AWS user group. Word of mouth is our best source of getting people aware of what it is that we do. So if you've liked what you've seen tonight, go and follow us on YouTube, send the links around to people, let them know that the user group exists, because that's a really great way for us to grow our community and get more people involved in talking about things that they've done with AWS. So on that note, we're going to wrap up here from the Canberra AWS office, and we will catch you all next month with a series of lightning talks around all sorts of topics. Thank you for spending your night with us, everyone. Have a good night.